Praise be to art, loftily elevated, to colour plain canvas, and driven by a wondrous power to create life with the stroke of a brush. So ran a song apparently sung during a 3-day festival celebrating the unveiling of a statue of Frans Hals in his hometown of Haarlem on the 14th of June 1900. As always with Hals, talk of magic brushstrokes and truthfulness to life aren't far behind. We're a lot less in thrall to pure illusionism than perhaps we were in the past. But is a lively touch all there really is to Hals? Jonathan Jones's review of the major survey at the National Gallery, Hals's first in 30-odd years, would seem to suggest as much. Jones finds the artist completely lacking, calling Hals' pictures technically brilliant but weirdly soulless, lacking inner lives and failing to communicate the person within, substituting life, whatever that might be, for a superficial liveliness of surface. Jones is openly despised by a large portion of The Guardian's readership, but the Hals review was so unexpectedly sour, it even got picked up by the Dutch press. Only a few years ago, Jones hailed Hals's staggering range and compassion. A decade before that, praising his joyous virtuosity, calling him a demonic conjurer of souls, capable of making you believe that a conscious mind is looking back at you from the picture. What could have caused this major decline? Could it be at all critically substantial, or does it betray a superficial reading based squarely on Jones's mood on the day? It may be easy to write off this kind of willful contrarianism as par for the course with weekly art journalism, but what's at stake when we write off a body of work like this? When we give up looking for worth or meaning? When we give up trying to see? Unlike the other two of the big three Dutch painters, Rembrandt, Vermeer, Hals is a complete specialist, in the same way Clara Peters or Adrian Kurter were with still life, Ruysdael or Hobbema with landscape. He completely dialed into one area of picture making. The unpromising real estate of portraiture was where he focused his time and energy. The unyielding field in which he cultivated pictorial meaning where it hadn't been fully cultivated before. For one thing, there's an implied changeability of mood to Hals' sitters, like the Dutch weather, or the precarious nature of the economy. In this portrait of Isaac Massa, there's a sense of friendship and intimacy. His expression conveys a subtle mixture of tiredness and playfulness, the open mouth of conversation, or perhaps even a head cold. Alert and idle at the same time, turning to hear or lost in thought, he seems distracted, his mind in two places, the room he and the painter are in, and a fairy tale forest outside. The rudimentary window, a thought balloon, showing his financial concerns abroad perhaps, or just a simple case of wanderlust. Much of this we can grasp without the historical information that Massa published several maps of Russia, where many of his business interests were based. The prickly holly he's toying with, for example, has a psychosocial dimension that goes beyond simplistic symbolism to express something about his relative worldliness and world-weariness, his comfort and discomfort in the world, articulating something we just inherently feel in the face, that he might be someone who likes to feel the sharp prick of life at his thumbs. Easily interested, and just as easily bored, now forever suspended between the two. Despite adapting many well-established portraiture conventions, people had never been pictured this agitated or atomised before, displaced, fluttering, out of focus, not just formally, but psychologically, running little empires full of doubts and insecurities, seen with all the microneuroses of self-consciousness and self-presentation with which they exist in the real world. One of the most characteristic touches in the portrait of Massa is Hal's adaptation of the so-called Renaissance elbow, leaning it over a chair, literally changing how the figure sits in the world of the picture, corkscrewing him, complicating him. It's also an ingenious device to get the head and hands closer together within the relatively small close-up format of the painting. Because Hal's solar system is really made up of three heavenly bodies, the left hand and the right hand, which orbit the head. From these we attempt to triangulate the character of the sitter. In couples and groups, they make up binary systems, constellations, galaxies. Pictures of the social universe he found himself in, studied with the same intensity as the heavens, or the new world of microscopic beasties. One of the most thrilling pictures in the current show is the portrait of Katharina Brugmann, exhibited publicly for the first time since the 1930s and reunited with its pendant, a portrait of her husband. Perhaps more than any other Hals, it's a tightly controlled drama of hands. One holding onto the chair, the other clutching a glove that's been peeled off, complementing the one that's missing from the portrait of her husband as if it transmigrated from picture to picture. One hand then closes, one falls open, one reaches out for stability, the other invites a small sense of abandon. One arm stops short, the other waterfalls from the top of the head to the bottom of the frame. A stiff, formal marriage portrait unfurls, removes its gloves, though it also speaks movingly of relationships and things like time, sacrifice, and compromise, with the barest hint of an hourglass in the pinched fingertips and the fanning lace and silk, her arm resting as if she were giving blood. Mixing formality and informality, tension and release, the fixed and the fugitive, the revealed and the withheld, the picture travels the extremes of the genre without any melodrama. One state of being simply melts into the other, as it does in natural human behaviour. The portrait of Katharina Brugmann is a stunningly painted picture, very consistent across its surface, but that's not all there is to Hals's range of physicality. If we look closely at the merry lute player, for example, there's a wide catalogue of mark-making. Scumbled strands of hair sit inches away from a column of buttery, finger-smudged tuning pegs. Tuning pegs which look as if they were dabbed on by the same thumb that now rests on the wooden neck. The nail on the thumb and that of the pinky catch subtly ridged highlights as they would in reality. The gathered edge of the stroke, which makes the pinky nail even imply a cuticle where it lifts off. The paint itself imitating the kind of pressure and release used in playing the instrument. But as illusionistic as it is, this whole right-hand side of the picture is a marvel of interlocking shapes, sudden lurching shifts in colour and tone, which are completely engrossing on a purely abstract level, and almost impossible to capture in reproduction. Moving over to the Berkemeyer, there's an extraordinary passage of painting in the area between the thumb, glass, and fingers. The negative space, almost a physical lump of light and air, cupped almost as surely as the light and liquid in the beaker above. A beaker which spirals off into several alternative ellipses. It's almost proto-cubist in its implications. But it's also not the only time Hals pairs object instability with pictures of drunkenness. Similarly, we shouldn't write it off as sloppiness, as he can clearly paint rock-solid glasses when he wants to. Throughout the show, the paint articulates the touch of objects and the play of light across their surfaces. This isn't flashy painting without purpose or variation, and unlike, say, Manet, who greatly admired Hals, or more obviously shallow painters like Sargent, there's an attentiveness to subtle differentiation, as opposed to generalised, quick strokes. This attentiveness to the stuff of the paint is taken to extremes in a large collaborative still life painted with Claes van Huysen, Hals painting the figure and Van Huysen supplying the fruits and vegetables. It's a strange picture from a time before we came to think of artists as lone geniuses. Here, each painter works within their specialism, but also combines forces. The result is an unexpectedly coherent picture of the physical world, the animated world of human beings, and the frozen world of things. Each is of a totally different order of being, the still life ever so slightly less saturated, more glazed, with none of the highlights on the fruit sparkling quite so much as the wedge of light between her inner eye socket and the bridge of her nose. Yet the two worlds are about to come into contact with one another. Her hand hovers over the strange intermediary zone where the baton is passed from one artist to the other. It's the focal crux of the painting, and yet it's the point where the sensible world seems to glitch. We could put it down to the nature of the picture's manufacture, that they fudged the transition, but it seems too specific for that, with a dark leaf merging into the cuff, a light one weaving itself into the basket, which weaves itself into her fingers. It stands firmly, and surely by design, at a point of extreme connection and disconnect, her hand almost radiating out a kind of force field, as much as it ostensibly disappears into the basket. This point of tension and ambiguity could have easily been smoothed over, but it wasn't. Similarly, the relatively thickly painted knife that sticks out of the watermelon looks a lot like it was probably painted by Hals. It's as if the object retains a kind of residue of the woman's touch. In the same way animate elements in an animation cell are of a totally different visual texture to objects in the background, the knife is an animated character layered over the static scene. Painting tasks were clearly divided up intelligently and with purpose in this picture. And painting with intelligence and purpose, rather than with flattery and dash, is clearly the beginning of our counter-argument to Jones's damning review. The large civic guard portraits are perhaps the most compelling evidence in this case. The pictures which required all his pictorial intelligence and insight. Jones finds them lacking when compared to the drama of Rembrandt's Night Watch, a picture which he suggests transcends its function as a group portrait to become an image of a raggle-taggle citizenry as tragicomic everymen facing the dark. Hals, he says, just shows them as they wished to be shown. But is it that simple? Arguably, the Night Watch is both wildly theatrical and contrary to purpose. On the other hand, there's a plain utilitarian modernity to Hals's guards, painted some years before. Banquet of the Officers of the St. George Civic Guard is handily numbered for reference, once again calling attention both to their individuality but also their uniformed anonymity. The anonymity which has also been forced upon them by the passage of time. Characteristically for Hals, the numbers are a great economical detail, at once functional and devastating in their character assassination. Hardly a raggle-taggle group of tragicomic everymen, the Civic Guard were elite club members. These aren't really soldiers at all, but wealthy businessmen playing ceremonial roles, guarding their own statuses, rather than the city gates. This is far clearer in Hals than in Rembrandt, and it begs the question, which artist really showed these men as they wanted to be seen? We're talking about their merits as pictures, of course, and not rating them for historical accuracy. There's a reason the Night Watch is celebrated, but that doesn't mean alternative approaches aren't valid. approaches which deal with contemporary reality head-on, and with no pretensions toward heroism or grand drama. An art of small, bland interactions, social manoeuvring, nice clothes, meeting and drinking in flatly lit rooms. Essentially, an art of human rather than artistic pretension. And a world far more recognisably our own than Rembrandt's. Hals also uses contextual devices to articulate the character of the sitters. Here, the flag across the window abstracts the outside world into patches of autumn, a metaphor, intentional or not, for the kind of relationship these men have with the outside world, at once abstract, distant, but also territorial, colonial. At the same time, the flag is pretty flimsily draped across. It's of a piece with the way Hals treats clothing and fabric generally, with people wrapped up in carapaces of silk and lace, almost for their own protection, building an architecture of finery around their bodies, an outer barrier of civilization, status, and stability, which is nevertheless equally slippery in substance as the paint, or the interlocking facets of their faces. Hals dotes on clothes, the whites and greys of his collars and cuffs, set against complex blacks, can be just as thrilling as Alex Katz's giant paintings of buildings at night. His approach to clothing generally is just as incisive as that artist's, the clothes not only articulating the sitter's social standing, but the experience, the texture of that social standing. Like Katz, Hals paints the betrothal of the individual and the social world officiated over by fashion. Their outfits, safety blankets, temporarily locking the sitters in place or tethering them to one another, binding them like a contract. Importantly, these aren't just accidents of historic fashion. None of his contemporaries made these shapes in these configurations. Puffs of shirt falling out of his deflated almshouse regent like tufts of straw from a scarecrow. His textile merchant Lucas de Klerk origamied into a series of sharp triangles. His silks and embroideries especially suggest a world of slippery surfaces and niggling anxieties. The garments just as in flux as the faces, betraying yet another layer of self-consciousness in their own put-togetherness. Hals's subject is partly the precarity with which people sit in the world, their sense of their own relative socio-economic stability or instability. And yet, as John Berger writes in his well-known essay, Hals and Bankruptcy, they are content to live with this instability, this constant speculation. In fact, they thrive under it. Consider the difference between these paintings of the same man a few years apart. The face has become creased, the landscape behind the curtain reduced to a framed picture on the wall, a possession. The whole thing is off-kilter, Berger writes, like a cabin at sea. One figure is anchored like a tree, the feet angled like a dancer's. The other tilts back dangerously on the legs of his chair. The sword becomes a stick, straining, bulging like his middle. And yet, for all the precarity, the figure in the second picture appears more believably in control, perhaps because of the instability surrounding him. One looks faintly absurd, the other has your livelihood in his hands. His head holds steady while everything beneath the shoulders is testing and straining, spinning in his chair like the Tasmanian devil, relentless, even at rest, like the new economy. The way they are painted also betrays a sense of the sitter's animated, flitting nature, hyper-aware of micro-fluctuations in their own self-awareness, just as they might be hyper-aware of fluctuations in the market. It's dashing and suave, but also a bit neurotic. The energy, caffeinated. The so-called pointless liveliness of Hals's brush, which Jones was irritated by, emerges, perhaps, as a formal device, suggestive of a life lived at a faster pace, and with greater risk than before. Hals's simultaneously bounding and halting touch, a formal language appropriate to portraiture, In a world where decision-making, calculating, and prospecting had come to replace contemplation, abstinence, and prayer, in what Berger called the new metaphysics of money. But tightly wound poems about businessmen aren't for everyone, and Hals wasn't limited to societal critique or shallow display. This relatively late portrait of a young woman, again very hard to put across in reproduction, is a quiet marvel of proximity and presence. There's nothing but time and a few feet of air between her and ourselves, and little sense of pretense or self-preservation. It's something of an outlier, though. By and large, Hals's sitters seem caught somewhere in the act of presenting themselves. It's close to the kind of thing we see in formal photography. Except Hals goes beyond the capabilities of a stills camera. His touch and attention to micro details of behaviour implying the moments before and after the shutter clicks. The self-monitoring we are barely conscious of, but which our bodies betray. Revealing the truth of the person not in how they appear, but in how they wish to appear. A very modern proposition. It's a subtle thing, done through a miraculous sleight of hand, perhaps without the sitter even noticing. In Hals's best pictures, neither the performance nor the act of putting on the performance are ever overdone, yet both are somehow clear and present conditions of the final image. We subconsciously infer a combination of direction and openness, receptiveness on either side of the canvas. The stage managing minimal but effective, highly orchestrated, but also, we sense, cooperative, if not entirely collaborative. In the end, Hals's portraits are perhaps all the more compelling, precisely because they're compelling in spite of themselves, in spite of their immediate purpose. Portraiture and art often being quite entirely different things. But Jonathan Jones says all this is boring. Critics are allowed to change position, but to say all this is dull, to wander around entertained only by silly moustaches, to overlook so many captivating details, images, thoughts. What happened?
I'm sheltering from the light rain underneath a market stall on Trafalgar Square. I'm trying to book tickets for the Frans Hals show at the National Gallery. It's New Year's Eve. It's busy outside the gallery, hushed inside. The way I imagine temporary exhibitions and concerts they put on during the war might have been. Like a held breath, a romantic idea. I spent the morning walking around Highgate Cemetery. A man took pictures of his Star Wars figures on top of one of the crypts. We're seeing Stop Making Sense at the Prince Charles Cinema at 6:30. A woman will say, "Fantastic, fantastic," after every song, and everyone will laugh. We'll get food in Chinatown. Walk through Camden to Primrose Hill. Watch the fireworks as we sink in the mud. I'm looking at a painting by Frans Hals. It's New Year's Eve.
Circumstances can play a significant role in how we view works of art. Vernon Lee wrote how everything from what you had for lunch to the weather to other people can affect the aesthetic experience. Can it be as simple as painting nerds had a better day than Jonathan Jones? Better viewing circumstances on a particular occasion? Maybe, but the experiment was repeatable. Viewing the show months later, this time at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, the conditions were completely different. The smaller rooms were crowded with visitors and heavily policed by gallery attendants. There was a very different hang, with fewer paintings, but much brighter lighting conditions. Also, a neon sign at the front door that recalled the Arctic monkeys circa 2018. For all the distractions, a wholly different set of details and thoughts occupied the attention on this viewing. It can be quite magical when works of art weave themselves into the memory for extra aesthetic reasons. But seeing these Hals paintings a second time, and on an unremarkable day, it was clear they could worm their way in on their own terms, that they weren't dependent on a happy New Year's Day for any kind of staying power. Plenty of people have experiences like these with works of art, but they aren't where criticism should begin or end. And experiences like Jones's should definitely not be where criticism ends. Perhaps the hang, or the lighting, or the colour on the walls could have been blamed for this sudden sour turn on paintings he'd previously praised to the skies, but that doesn't seem to be the case. They just didn't do it for him anymore, for whatever reason. The review could have been an enlightening look at how our relationship with art can change, how previously cherished works can abandon you as life goes on. Instead, Jones seems almost personally betrayed by these pictures. Apparently inscrutable, miserly pictures, they've run out of things to give him. Everywhere Jonathan Jones looks in the Hals show, he sees only limitation. Limitation of genre, limitation of theme, ambition, imagination. Even Hals's celebrated modernity is for Jones nothing more than a superficial quality of his handling. He refuses to see, or no longer can see, the picture's modernity of experience, of consciousness, their distinct contribution to the genre, their subtlety. Subtlety and modernity seem to have become suspect things for Jones. He calls Hals's art nervous, twitchy, arguing for the grandiosity of Rembrandt, as if that were the only thing art can or should be. Enthralled to Renaissance ideals of the human body and spirit, it never seems to occur to him that great art can also be nervous and twitchy, and it's left him critically myopic. Seeing the portrait of Katarina Brugmann, a knockout painting last seen in public since the 1930s, and having nothing to say about it, is absurd. Particularly when we compare the picture and its pendant with Rembrandt's celebrated portraits of Martin Solomons and Oppian Coppet from the same year. Both sets of portraits were painted in 1634, but for all their striking similarities of poses and props, they are light years apart. The Rembrandts are generally stiffer, more placid, the Hals livelier, though holding their poses with more visible effort, more implied self-monitoring and adjustment. The relatively early career Rembrandts do loosen up in places, particularly in areas of clothing, hands, and fabrics. The paint taking on a greater degree of freedom in these areas, though never reaching the extent of Hals's fluidity. The handling of the paint itself encodes a completely different sense of time in the two sets of pictures, though the most obvious difference is in their size and portioning. Unlike the full-length Rembrandts, Hals's pictures are much closer to us in the frame, adding to their naturalism and making them seem far more present and far less monumental. Big differences aside, they also negotiate their own sense of formality and informality in very different ways, finding their own points of tension and release. Importantly, none of these pictorial solutions offer right or wrong answers. They are just different possibilities. Two ways of looking at the same challenge. Two equally valid ways of meeting the brief. Joint purchased by the Rijksmuseum and the Louvre for €160 million in 2015 and subsequently immortalised in plastic by Playmobil. The portraits set a record price for works by Rembrandt. But are they demonstrably worth that much more as pictorial propositions? Are the Hals any less valuable a contribution to the genre? Isn't the portrait of Catharina Brugmann just as invaluable an addition to what we know about the possibilities of portrait painting in the year 1634? For Jones, of course, it's just another picture, not even worth a mention. As great as the portrait of Catharina Brugmann is, for most critics and historians, it's the modernity of the Regentesses which perhaps represents the final word on Hals's formal and thematic complexity within the confines of portraiture. It's an unignorable last achievement which would surely save him from any dismissal, perhaps even Jonathan Jones's, had it travelled to the London iteration of the show. Painted when Hals was around 80 years old, the Regent and Regentess pictures are portraits of the senior staff at the Haarlem Old Men's Home, a charitable institution which supported the artist financially in his last years, though it's no longer believed he was ever a resident there. Today, the old almshouse building is the Frans Hals Museum, where the portraits of the regents and regentesses now reside. In the 1970s, there was something of a critical scuffle over the true nature of the almshouse pictures. Most publicly, John Berger used Hals' authority Seymour Slive's account of the paintings to make a key argument in Ways of Seeing, his 1972 book and TV series of the same name. Berger quotes Slive's analysis at length, analysis which speaks of harmonious fusion, mighty impulses, and life's vital forces. Language like this, Berger says, is a form of mystification. What's important to note for our purposes is that language like this can be used to praise an artist, but in the hands of writers like Jones, it can also be used to bury them. Berger expands on his argument in the book version, detailing how academic art experts use fairly valid formal analysis to draw completely invalid conclusions. Conclusions about mighty impulses and life's vital forces, which are exactly the kinds of things Jones is looking for in Hals. In a sense, Jones is upset because Hals isn't living up to the mystification. He's looking for something that was never there in the first place, the most elevated something which is indefinable but somehow easier to point to in the luminous worlds of Rembrandt or Vermeer, worlds more susceptible to mystification than Hals's prickly Polaroid kingdom. Jones sums up that life itself doesn't breathe in Hals' pictures, apparently the only criteria for their success. He repeats the critical fallacy that only a searing art of life, lived at high pitch intensity, can make truly great art. What he isn't doing is looking and seeing an emergent society, our emergent society, establishing and presenting itself in Hals' best pictures. It's a refusal to recognise Hals' art of small middle-class worries, social ambition and anxiety, social climbing and manoeuvring matched by inertia and numbness. A refusal to see how small flickers of social anxiety can just as eloquently speak of big things like the nature of consciousness or the smallness of life against the passage of time. Class consciousness in Hals goes way back, even to this very early picture of a nurse and child. The child grabs and pushes the nurse away, asserts control. And yet, responsibility of the child has been given over to her, held as she is, like the little fruit. The nurse leans to the side, almost as if she ended up included by accident while she got on with her job, tending to the child out of shot. A whole relationship is implied, which may be loving and tender, but it's based on firm social and economic conditions. And it's also on borrowed time. It's a moving picture not only of the temporality of infancy, but of guardianship specifically, and of social relationships in general. In that sense, it's also a great picture with which to measure the very late pictures of the regentesses. Hals's attitude to these caregivers, who keep their charges at arm's length, is much colder, much harsher in its judgments. Though it also doesn't preclude tenderness and empathy. The rawness of the old lady's dry hands a chink of humanity in their pictorial armour. Berger writes that we should look at the pictures and make up our own minds as to whether the regents and regentesses are good Samaritans or judgmental hypocrites. As we aren't privy to Hals's private thoughts, that's all we can do. In contrast to the flashier portraits of his earlier career, they certainly seem much more sombre, even bitter pictures. The old lightness and quickness, the reciprocal relationship between portraitist and sitter has soured and hardened into a small pearl of mutual disgust. They quietly judge him. He judges them for judging him. A helping hand becomes a request for payment, or a dismissal, a shrug. It says, "We have done all we can." Even their condescending to sit for him seems like one of their humanitarian duties. Hals's contempt for those he has come to rely on is the kind of contempt unthinkable by the privileged or philanthropic. Quite an astounding thing in pictures essentially about the nature of institutional charity. In The Regents, there's perhaps even a gesture of contempt from Hals towards his entire career. The eye-catching knee, an orange in a white napkin. Almost a parody of the typical Hals portrait. Could it be an acerbic parody of his life's work? Something like Lake Guston, but even more damningly bleak? One last pile-up of human vice, hypocrisy and stupidity from a man who spent his career dabbing ruddy flesh tones above lace collars? But are we projecting here? Berger writes convincingly on the contempt for the old and wretched these men and women have pledged themselves to in his 1966 essay, Hals and Bankruptcy. But the piece is presented as a condensed drama of Hals's life, seen through a series of vignettes based on his paintings. Importantly, it's not presented as any kind of pictorial analysis. In that sense, Berger is in danger of falling into precisely the kind of unargued, unjustified mystification that he found in the art historian's waffle about mighty impulses. After all, Berger was also a novelist, a storyteller first and foremost. His fiction-making instincts would even lead him to write his fullest, most sustained pictorial analysis on Hals around a painting of a nude that doesn't exist, but which he imagines him making in great detail. In summing up, Berger writes that the real drama of the almshouse pictures is a poor man having to paint those he is indebted to. But how do we know this is so? How can we make such a claim without resorting to questions of biography, to information outside the picture? Look at the faces. Decide for yourself, he says. If we're going to do more than decide for ourselves, if we want to convince others, if we, in other words, want to get into criticism, then we really need to go back to the kind of formal analysis which he said ensconces the picture in the mystifying territory of art appreciation. And we might find that rather than smothering the picture, such analysis lets it breathe, expand. For example, much is made of the formal gravity of the composition in most accounts of the regentesses, which may sound meaningless, but really it's the roughly hewn strength of the faces and collars hung across the dark, which actually emphasises the old women's frailty, their smallness, their twitchy biological presence within their costume, their setting, and by thematic extension, their institution and society. And with that, they recapitulate the narrative of all Hal's successful people in their slippery situations, that it could all be easily torn away, that these old ladies, these slumped, inebriated old men, could just as easily find themselves in the poorhouse. This is what they see when they look at Hals. He's everything they've fortified themselves against. In the end, it's the formal strength of the picture matched with the physical weakness and moral failure of the subjects which gives the painting its meaning and power, quite aside from any talk of mighty impulses and harmonious fusion. Complicating matters, some historians argue the picture has significantly darkened over time. You might wonder where this leaves our reading of it. But even allowing for the heightened drama that it might have taken on over time, the painting still has an almost ascetic, formal austerity. An austerity similar to that of André Durand's great 1914 picture of two sisters, say. What's important to note is that for all these two paintings share a certain formal potency, owing to similar formal characteristics, they are also fundamentally different, in hard to pin down but immediately felt things like sentiment and mood, in how we're directed to feel about them. Comparing them illustrates the sliver of cruelty in the old woman's charity, something quite alien to the two sisters' very different image of care. Two sisters is an image of the internalized sorrow of acceptance. One sister, like an invalid or a child in the oversized chair, still half questioning her options, looking out of the frame. The other, part governess, part nursemaid, resigned, looking at us, seeing the frame, knowing her cage. And yet, the monumental gravity of the picture which traps them also gives them a kind of strength. The same pictorial gravity which leaves the regentesses morally diminished, specks of flesh in a shrinking universe. Most tellingly, we could imagine the regentesses looking down on the sisters with a kind of spiteful pity, but not the other way around. Once again, look at the faces. Decide for yourself. In the end, all we can do is to look. To look attentively and critically, but to really look in the first place. To keep your eyes open. To beware of mystification. To decide for yourself. And if we are to be sceptical of mystifying praise, we should be equally intolerant of Jones's unargued dismissal. Nobody's seriously worried about what Jones has to say in a fairly popular Middleborough context like a newspaper review. It certainly won't do Hals's reputation any lasting damage. On the other hand, isn't a large, popular readership important? Aren't these the people Berger pleaded with on BBC Two in the early 1970s to keep their eyes and minds open, to watch out for mystification? Unfortunately, Jones positions himself as a kind of plain-speaking, demystifying agent, when all he actually does is erase any meaning from the pictures, to the point where they become so apparently transparent, they're effectively invisible. Using mystification to build something up, to enable it, to protect it, is dangerous. Using it to attack, to reduce, to erase, that can be just as insidious. In 1955, François Truffaut wrote an essay defending Nicholas Ray's Johnny Guitar, a film that had generally met with laughter from American critics. Truffaut called it the beauty and the beast of westerns, a dream western. Closing the piece, he wrote that anyone who rejects Johnny Guitar should never go to the movies again, never see any more films. Such people will never recognise inspiration, poetic intuition, or a framed picture, a shot, an idea, a good film, or even cinema itself. As a rejection of critics with a lack of imagination, it's pretty damning. Replace the words movie, film, and cinema with painting, picture, and art, and you have the only appropriate response to Jonathan Jones's mystifying criticisms.